There does seem to then also be this debate about things like immigration. If you want to take the kind of right-wing view that says that, well, of course, the rioting and violence is terrible, but we need to have a debate about immigration. And then there's a bit of a theme from the 2011 kind of London riots where it all becomes about inequality. And, there's some articles around the fact that these are some of the most deprived areas in the country.
I think it's two-tier. I think that there is absolutely a two-tier response by our commentariat.
Thoughts on the crash? Why did Hackney said, I don't know if I knew socialism would work. I've spent my entire career studying precisely market crashes and recessions, and in the end, there's something just completely unknowable about it.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Tom Cloggesy, my co-host Matthew Lesh, and joining us on the podcast this week, the Executive Director and Principal of Europe Economics, Andrew Lilico. Our goal is to bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headline analysis and shallow political commentary you'll get elsewhere, and instead focus on the big ideas and deeper principles that lie behind the news. This week, we're going to be talking about monetary policy. The Bank of England has finally cut interest rates, but is it too little, too late? We're going to be talking about this week's volatility in financial markets and whether it portends a more general slowdown or even recession. But first, we're going to talk about the riots that sparked off across the UK, or across England at least, over the last week. Do they tell us anything deeper and more meaningful about British society? And do they suggest that policy changes are needed? Matthew, why don't you kick us off on that first topic?
Well, of course. So the murder of 3 children in Southport last week sparked a series of far-right protests, indeed right across the United Kingdom, including some quite extraordinary scenes in Northern Ireland with both sides of the traditional conflict coming together for perhaps the worst possible reason. An expected upsurge this week did not eventuate, although there's still questions about whether there could be more riots coming soon. But I suppose the questions do still remain about the driving factors and the government's response. Andrew, can I bring you in first? I'm wondering, what's your read on the situation? What do you think is driving this, I suppose, sudden emergence of perhaps insanity on the streets or violent action?
Well, in general, when there are riots, that seems to me to be the wrong way round of thinking about the question, because I think that the state of nature is that we find it natural to riot. I think that going in looting, burning buses, burning buildings, and generally causing mayhem are what people revert to under very little provocation. Few beers on a Saturday night, and it used to be an overexcitable football match. You go off to Ibiza on a stag do, and this is just what people do. And if they think they can get away with it, then they will do that. So the question that you should ask when there are riots is what's made people think that on this occasion they can get away with it? Not why do they don't need a motivation to do it. They need general pressures not to do it. And the ways in which riots are normally prevented are by a kind of combination of there's some sort of personal morality. There's the police to some extent. There's what I would call magic. So there are kind of statements by the priests and the politicians and whatever, and they declare that there will be order, and we fall under their spell, and we just accept that that's going to happen. And so regretfully, we can't go and loot that TV or whatever it was that we wanted to grab, at least not until tomorrow. And then finally, there's a sense of vague threat. So what typically happens with riots is that something happens to make people see through the sort of confidence trick that policing order normally maintains, because we don't have anything like enough police resources to keep down riots if everybody turned up on the streets at the same time, and neither should we, right? It's not a comment about not having enough police. The point is that policing by its nature is a kind of fractional reserve thing, like the amount of cash you have in the bank, right? Everybody turns up.
That's exactly what I was thinking, and it's the most free market economics point you could possibly make. And I was thinking this even before our discussion, like, keeping order, stopping riots, it's a lot like fractional reserve banking. It just relies on not everyone having the same idea at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if they do, you're easily overwhelmed.
I think I'm keen to step back into the kind of policy debate that's been sparked here, because it does seem this almost like a Rorschach test. You can look at the riots, you can take from them whatever you want. And I think there is something to that, the line you're going on, which is a whole bunch of young, energized men perhaps having a little too much drink. I know there was this quite extraordinary case of this gay couple who went to bingo, one of whom is a postman, had got absolutely wasted both at the bingo and subsequently were on their way out to grab another drink, and then somehow on the way to grab another drink ended up leading a riot and now in jail for 2 years. And you look at those kind of cases and there's a lot of questions about cocaine taking and illegal drugs amongst these kind of young men that then spurs them up even more. I think there's definitely something to that, and there's definitely a strong element to it, the kind of football hooliganism of it. But there does seem to then also be this debate about things like immigration, and about if you want to take the kind of right-wing view that says that, well, of course, the rioting and violence is terrible, but we need to have a debate about immigration. And then, there's a bit of a theme from the 2011 kind of London riots where it all becomes about inequality. And, there's some articles around the fact that these are some of the most deprived areas in the country. There were very real cases, I think, of racism and xenophobia where you have people burning down refugee hotels. And then, of course, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, I think, because it deserves a longer discussion around kind of fake news and disinformation online. It just to me, it just seems like you can almost choose your own analysis. You can choose your own adventure, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to minimize the riots at all. I mean, I think they're absolutely appalling, and it's really shocking to see these kind of things happen in Britain. For everything that Andrew has just said, you just don't expect this kind of thing. I mean, bear in mind those 2011 riots were almost exactly the same time of year. There is something about heat, there's something about school holidays, there's something about a trigger which may not be directly related to the eventual riots, but somehow just sparks these things off. So, I mean, we should take them seriously, we should condemn them. The people who have participated should be punished. But saying all of that, I think we need to think of these policy issues separately. I don't think that we really want to sit here thinking like, what do the riots mean about immigration? What do the riots mean about the government's asylum policy? What do the riots mean about social media regulation? You called it a Rorschach test, and you said, you could kind of see in these events whatever you wanted to see. And that's quite a telling point, right? People on the right and people on the left have both taken what's happened and used it to sort of validate the things they believed before, which I think really tells you it's not that meaningful in a bigger, deeper sense. What was true before the riots is probably true now. And so it's more about like seeking that deeper truth. What is the right take on immigration? How should we restrict, if we want to restrict it at all, free speech, particularly on the internet? And so my views haven't changed there. I think it's pretty clear that the government, successive governments, but over many years, have failed to deliver what the public wants on immigration. Whether we agree with what the public wants is a different matter. But I think to repeatedly make the promise and then to fail to deliver on it, or in fact to do the complete opposite, which is what we saw most recently under the Conservatives, that is bound to stoke anger and resentment and frustration, completely separate from the riots. As for the questions around online free speech and everything.
Well, let's come to
you want to believe that
I want to unpack one other point here, which is, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on Andrew, which is there is an obvious kind of incoherence to this in terms of we have mosques being targeted. That does seem like a case of potential kind of racist attacking. On the other hand, though, you have people burning down libraries, and I don't think that's necessarily a political act per se. But then I think there are genuine questions about also there were counter protests, some of which turned quite violent in Birmingham. There was some speech at protests in London from, I think it was a Labour councillor who's now been arrested over it because he was inciting violence as well. Is there a decent case, do you think? And of course, so another case, this was Jess Phillips, who seemed to back a violent jester. She's a minister in the Home Office who backed a violent jester at the counter protests in Birmingham, and there were a bunch of Sky News reporters out to run away. Is there a case here of inconsistent reporting or two-tier policing? Do you worry about any of that?
Well, that was kind of where one of the things I was going to come to in the way that I was thinking about the question before. It's because, I think that there's very little, an important thing to bear in mind is that the number of people who are involved in these kinds of events is absolutely tiny. And the points of view which they reflect are absolutely tiny proportions for all communities. So I don't think that the fact that some people go off and do some appalling burning down of some asylum seeker hotel or something tells you anything really about the attitude of Britain in general to asylum seekers. It may tell you that we on this occasion, and maybe that's a failing of ours, failed to protect those asylum seekers, and that maybe there's some lessons to learn about that. But I think that the more significant point is what kind of triggers were there? What was it that made people think that on these occasions they were going to get away with it? And I think that part of what goes on in these situations is it's absolutely, if it's hot and dry, then people, if it's pouring with rain, you don't think so many people are going to go. So if it's hot and dry, you're more likely to get there. If it's hot and dry, people get bad-tempered. If they've seen other recent events where the police failed to put them down, then they will think that they're going to get away with it as well. So, for example, there were the events that I don't think it's a coincidence that there were the riots about when I think it was Romanian children were taken away from their parents, and then there were riots associated with that, and the police withdrew from that only a few weeks ago. I think that the fact that when you have events like that and the police are seen as defeated, that makes it more likely. You had very similar events happen as part of the trigger to the 2011 riots. There were a couple of cases where the police were defeated, and then thereafter the riots went very large.
It's also worth saying that the government recently projected the fact that the prisons are full, and that probably didn't help either. Tom, moving on to that point, we're interested in digital regulation. So a lot of the subsequent discourse has become about disinformation being spread online, particularly the false claims that the original attack had something to do with Islam. There's concern about Telegram, the encrypted messaging service being used to organize some of the rioting. There's questions about Elon Musk, the owner of Twitter or X, about his kind of support and his political views. And I think we are seeing very much this concern about, is there now this kind of authoritarian push coming in response to the riots, where there's kind of...
I think it's two-tier. I mean, I think that there is absolutely a two-tier response by our, if not by our police. I mean, I think that there are, genuine questions to ask about whether there's actual two-tier policing. But I think that there's very clearly a two-tier reaction by our commentariat. So when you had, for example, everybody was complaining that all these people turned out in Stockport on the basis of misinformation spread by Andrew Tate or whatever about what was going on. So loads of people then turn up and everyone says, that's appalling, shows how terrible social media is. Then a couple of days ago, thousands of people turned out in whatever these 36 locations were, which somebody got via some complete misinformation on Telegram. Well, somehow we have the idea, and everybody then congratulated themselves.
Because the counter protest was so big and there was no one there for the rioting, or very few people.
But there were some people who rioted on those occasions. It wasn't nobody, and it would only have been a minority of the people on the other occasions as well. So I think it's clear that there's two-tier responses by our commentariat. I also think that it's extremely unhelpful for the police to be so adamant and the politicians to be so adamant in dismissing concerns about two-tier policing. Identifying two-tier policing would require all kinds of statistical tests of saying what the particular concern is, how you categorize things, what's the relationship between the police response in this situation and that situation. And I simply don't believe they've done any of the statistical analysis. I think that they are just airily dismissing concerns that there's asymmetry here. And they have no basis for dismissing those concerns whatsoever. Imagine if somebody said, there were concerns about racism in stop and search, and the police said, that's a load of nonsense. I mean, we haven't done any statistical tests to prove that it's nonsense, but it's just a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
Imagine the response that people would have to that. I mean, they would rightfully think that was a shameful response. But somehow in these kinds of instances, if you say, because two-tier policing, what was it? There was the Sarah Everard, right? That was one of the classic instances of two-tier policing allegation, that the treatment of the people at the vigil of this poor woman who was murdered by the policeman were treated very differently from people going on at the same time, say, BLM protesters at the same time. That wasn't anything to do with those women at that vigil being far right or being some kind of enormous threat or something. It was just that the treatment was very different in those contexts. Now, there might be perfectly legitimate reasons why the treatment was different. As it happened, the police paid compensation on that occasion. So in the end, it turned out maybe there weren't legitimate reasons. But you can't just say, without doing any statistical analysis whatsoever, that the idea of two-tier policing is complete nonsense.
I want to go on back to the speech issue.
Well, I want your take on it, actually, Matthew, because this is an area you work on. You do tech policy here at the IEA. I think your view may be more informed than mine. But, I mean, actually, what can the government do about end-to-end encrypted services? Is the danger not that they failing to be able to do anything there, they just focus on public social media, which won't make much difference anyway.
I think going back to the Rorschach test point here, which is there is this tendency after, and we saw this after the 2011 riot, to look at the communications technique that people are using. So there were articles at the time about how people were using BlackBerry messaging and how we need to crack down on messaging. And you can go back hundreds of years to people complaining about the printing press as an enabler of writing. There is always this view to see speech as something that is inherently dangerous and needs to be restricted in order to prevent people from undertaking certain activities, rather than dealing with we don't know we don't have a perfect answer to what drove the riots, but it's such a distraction to start talking about speech rather than thinking about, well, why are these men rioting? Is it because of hooliganism? Is it because of xenophobia? Whatever it is, whatever the question is, then it's so much easier for politicians then say, well, actually, isn't this the terrible fault of Telegram messaging? In terms of the practical policy response here, so there's the core answer of it is, unless you're basically going to shut down the internet, you are still going to have encrypted communications and people are going to be able to send messages to each other. This is an issue that the government faces constantly with things like terrorism. Good luck stopping it for this other use. Unless you want the state reading all your private messages and you don't want the encryption to exist, which I think is generally accepted as a good thing, that we can speak to each other securely and we can do transactions online securely with our banking provider. And then, unfortunately, you can shut down Telegram, but it's probably just the speech will inevitably go somewhere else. I think I'm quite concerned, though, about some of the individual cases where the government is using the existing speech laws in order to go after people who put up posts on social media. And I think a lot of those posts on social media were ill-advised. They were mis or disinformation, but I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to use the force of the law to go against people unless they are, and this is important here, if someone is specifically inciting violence, and that is a criminal act and they should be prosecuted for it, and that should be done in a consistent way. There's a case that seems to be popping up at the moment where they're trying to use the new Online Safety Act false communications offence in order to go after people who put out false information about the original protest. And the point that's, I think, missing here is that there's actually quite a high threshold for that offence. So that threshold requires you to knowingly spread false information. So you have to know it was wrong with the intent to cause some kind of non-trivial harm, either physical or psychological. So if someone says something like, I've heard a rumor that perhaps it's true that the person who murdered these girls in Southport was a Muslim terrorist, that's not necessarily against the false communications offence, because it's not clear that they necessarily knew that they were lying. So I think the police and the prosecutors need to be very careful with this law, because otherwise you're basically going to have a truth law, is you're going to be going after people simply for saying something that's untrue. That's not what this law should be doing. It's not what the law is meant to be doing. And people should be able to say untrue things, because we don't want the state and we don't want the courts deciding, except perhaps in defamation where you can actually show harm. For the most part, you don't want the courts deciding what is true and not true on social media.
Can't ban good faith speculation, or you shouldn't be banning good faith speculation.
Indeed. Maybe it is bad faith speculation, but it's slightly bad faith speculation. But unless you can show that intent, I think we're setting such a dangerous precedent.
I miss the danger with poorly drafted broad laws. That, I mean, it's the kind of thing the government will try and use, even if it's not really in line with the original intent or, the precise drafting. And so I guess we'll see how that goes. But why don't we move on to our next topic about the volatility in financial markets this week? Has it been a busy or stressful week for you, Andrew? Or?
Not particularly. No, I've not been involved.
More volatility here and everywhere we see. So, of course, there was a bit of a panic earlier this week in the stock market with concerns about some kind of impending global recession. As the week's gone on, there's very much been a rebound. The bulk of the losses from Monday's heavy sell-off have reversed. Andrew, you were following this all quite closely. What's going on here? What happened?
I think there are a couple of elements here. So one is a concern that the Federal Reserve has waited too long before cutting interest rates. The money supply growth in the US as in the UK went very, very low a year and so ago, and you'd expect those sorts of chickens to be coming home to roost either later this year or early next year in terms of undershooting inflation, perhaps having some damage to on the real economy side as well. Maybe in the UK slightly earlier, maybe October, November for that. Though of course lags are long and uncertain, as we always say. So maybe it will be another 18 months after that. Who knows? But that's one of the concerns. A second concern is that one of the countervailing effects to that was some things associated with new technology. So, for example, there have been a number of studies that have been quite bullish about the impacts of AI technologies. So sectors that were more exposed to AI had 5 times the productivity growth of sectors that were less exposed to AI. Whereas there may be at least some market players were reevaluating their view about how about the kind of AI revolution. And you might, and it's a thing that happens with various new technologies. Sometimes people think that they're really good, but then they, even if they are good, they may not be quite as good as the most optimistic picture that's developed at some point, and people can pile in, and then you can get a bubble. I don't actually perceive the recent situation as being like that. I mean, I don't think it's really like the tech bubble of the early 2000s, or people go on about like the electricity things in the 30s, or the railways in the 1880s, and all of that kind of malarkey. You get those sorts of events. I just don't personally see that as being the situation here. But that's another element to what's going on. And I think part of the reason things are reversed out so much is that things weren't at that exaggerated level, if you see what I mean. So, yeah.
And then, of course, the element that you might have also someone to say of is what was going on with Japan and the Japanese central bank deciding to put up rates that then led to a whole bunch of required selling off in the US market because there's been all this borrowing.
Yeah, there were some technical factors as well, actually.
Yeah.
It's quite sort of striking, I think, that Japan raised their policy rate from 0 to 0.25. If I'm right about that, am I right?
It is extraordinarily low.
It's extraordinarily low, and now obviously they've had some pretty long run kind of economic pathologies in Japan, different economy from ours. But it's sort of striking that they would be in such a different situation from the West. But I mean, does this sort of speak to different approaches to monetary policy during the pandemic? They didn't have the big inflation spike, as I understand it, that we experienced over here.
Absolutely. Japan was one of the places that didn't have nearly so much inflation as we had. The Japanese have kind of been doing their own thing a bit since the early 1990s. So I don't think you would necessarily expect them to be precisely aligned. They have different economic cycles and different kinds of exposures. So, yeah, and if you don't have the same kind of inflation, then you don't get the same drivers. Also, I think that they continue to have quite significant underlying problems that mean that they struggle to get inflation high enough to justify getting their interest rates up. It would be much healthier to have interest rates at 4%.
I think they have some very strong cultural norms against price rises that seem to play out. As in, it is just insulting their customers to put up prices, and they really that means that there isn't the inflation perhaps there should be. It just kind of keeps everything down a bit. It's kind of an interesting issue. On the broader issue, though, of the kind of jumps around the stock market, I really love the response from John Cochrane, the Stanford University Hoover Institute economist, who put out a post and said a few times this week, when asked, thoughts on the crash, why did it happen? He said, I don't know if I knew socialism would work. I've spent my entire career studying precisely market crashes and recessions, and in the end, there's something just completely unknowable about it. It should almost be our should be hijacking on it. It's like it's fascinating to think about and speculate and put out some potential reasons why it might have happened, but we should be realistic here that these things do happen. That is the way stock markets work. There might be some underlying truth to the kind of values that they get to, but that doesn't mean that we can understand or should ever expect to understand.
Well, that's an implication of efficient markets. Is that so? If markets are efficient, then you won't be able to predict crashes.
Yeah,
which is of course part of which should have been the answer to the Queen's question, or why did nobody see it coming in terms of 2008 and so on. Is that these you can't. An example I always give about these kinds of things to try to explain to give people the intuition is: suppose that you had a perfect way of forecasting every time there would be an earthquake that more than 1,000 people would die in. What would happen then is you'd never have an earthquake where more than 1,000 people died, because everybody would move away from it. So what happens is that if market players had some good way of anticipating that there was going to be a crash in August, then they'd sell in July, and the crash wouldn't happen in August.
Yeah.
So
it's priced in. Any existing knowledge is priced in. So what's the craziness is not. I think it's probably the same issue with stress tests, isn't it? It's you try to do a stress test of banks and in response to potential change in market conditions, but you prepare for whatever the stress test is, and then if it goes a little bit further than that, as happened with Silicon Valley Bank, for example, recently, last year. It just all goes wrong.
I mean, we're clearly blending our second and third topics here, but I think that's quite appropriate. They are linked, and I'm interested to pursue this monetary policy point a little bit further. Andrew, as well as your main career, you are the co-chair of the IEA's Shadow Monetary Policy Committee.
Correct.
And I think to a certain extent, the SMPC has covered itself in a degree of glory over the last few years. You saw the inflation coming. You were calling for tightening of monetary policy well ahead of other commentators. But, and this is an important point, things have switched, and for some time now, the Shadow Monetary Policy Committee has been concluding at its meetings that central banks, the Bank of England in particular, are being too slow to loosen monetary policy again, that monetary growth, as you said, has been extremely sluggish, sluggish to the extent that you would expect it, with that long and variable lag, to lead to some significant downturn, even a recession. Forgive me if I'm overstating it, but that's sort of been my reading of the SMPC and other people who are in the same sort of monetarist space. How worried are you about that? Because it was beginning to seem to me, we should be seeing the ill effects of overly tight monetary policy by now. But maybe the lag was a little longer than we expected.
Well, the peak contraction was to September 2023. It was the peak in the monetary contraction. Right. So you'd normally expect that things to kick in. Some studies, on the US, are between 17 and 23 months. The UK might be a bit more variable, something like 18 to 36 months. And so the time scale from September 2023, 18 months after that, you think March 2025 is when you would have the kind of peak of these effects. So that's about then that you'd expect the maximum undershoot in inflation to be occurring. Now, it's never mechanical, and it's also it depends to some extent on what was happening before that as well. Because if you can imagine, you've got multiple. If I've got a lag from I take 1 month and the lag is variable. Well, of course, the lag might have been variable from what happened 6 months before that as well. And so if you have a rapid contraction, then you might still have some hangover of the spillover effects into bleeding out over those 18 to 36 month period of earlier rapid monetary growth. I mean, monetary growth more than 15% if you went back 18 months before that. So I think that I don't think that the situation is yet one in which one is appealing to, it's one of those occasions where the lag's longer. Yeah. We've not got there yet. And it's also the case that monetary growth was starting to be slower before the peak of the contraction. But it was also the case that we've had fairly sluggish growth in the UK, at least until fairly recently. The most recent quarter wasn't too bad. But and we have tended to undershoot the Bank of England's predictions of what was going to happen to inflation by quite significant numbers, in fact, since late last year.
I'm speaking really in terms of, we know the way you think about this, which is to put some emphasis on the monetary aggregates and the impact that has on the economy, even if there's a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the lags. That is certainly not the way the Monetary Policy Committee views this, or the Bank of England views this. I can't quite work out what their theory is. There was this chart that went around recently with about 8 different mechanisms for monetary policy, none of which seem to involve money directly. Where do you think they are currently at on this kind of really fundamental question? It's like, what if you don't have a theory of what you're doing, then you don't know what to do in response?
So there's a couple of things to say on that. So one is that they have recently started to have some discussions of the impacts of money again. And that's partly because they came under a lot of pressure on these with questioning. Andrew Bailey got some quite pointed questioning from Mervyn King before House of Lords committees on this. I found Andrew Bailey's responses on some of these things quite peculiar, and I think Mervyn King did as well. So he was asked what his theory was of inflation, and as far as I could see, he didn't have one. Right? It certainly didn't have any kind of pat concise answer to what's your theory of inflation when he was put that question multiple
He didn't say inflation
times.
is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
Well, but it wasn't just that. There's other things that you could have, there's other kinds of theories that you could have gone with, but he didn't have any sort of answer to that at all, which seems a remarkable thing for a central bank governor to not have a pat answer to the question of what's your theory of inflation. Especially, it's a pretty obvious kind of a question to be asked under circumstances in which the inflation is significantly overshot and people are querying you, right? You've got to, what's your defense of what it is that you did? What was your theory, and what's your explanation of why your theory hasn't been defeated? So I found that very peculiar. Ben Bernanke did a recent study for the Bank of England reviewing its models. Of course, it wasn't his job to say what kind of theory of inflation they should have, but he was suggesting that there should be more. It should be the committee should be more proactive in informing, in getting the bank to run different kinds of scenarios and things that related to whatever theory it was that they had. But you have so few, it's been a very long time in which they have so few people on the Monetary Policy Committee who are actual monetary theory experts. You have lots of people there who know things about labour economics and about trade and things like this, but very few people who actually know anything about monetary economics specifically. And it's good to have diversity of opinion, or a diversity of angle to some extent. But even amongst those that do know anything about monetary theory, there's a very, very narrow set of ideas. I would have thought that what you would want to have is some coverage, a breadth of different kinds of monetary theory, and then 2 or 3 people who brought a different angle, like a bit of.
Well, if anyone would like to nominate one Andrew Lilico for a position on the Monetary Policy Committee, I understand he's very busy, but if called upon, he may just serve. One last topic I'm actually keen to get everyone's thoughts on, and Tom, maybe this is one for you first, because I know you think about these kind of fiscal issues quite a lot, which is there was some speculation this week, and I think the Chancellor hasn't denied it, that the government will change their rules for borrowing so that they take off the losses from QE, which do relate to the Bank of England, because the government did indemnify them for those losses, and that'll allow them to basically borrow a bit more come the next budget. I think the question there is, first of all, is it legitimate to not count those particular losses from the Bank of England? And then I suppose there's a secondary question which is around these fiscal rules and whether or not it's the right fiscal rules and whether or not it's the time to borrow more.
Yeah, I mean, on the fiscal rules more broadly, I don't really have a problem with them tweaking the rules. I mean, after all, every chancellor has repeatedly tweaked the rules to try and make it a little bit easier for themselves. I mean, that does really call into question the whole concept of fiscal rules potentially and how useful they are. I think they mostly serve as a sort of signalling device to financial markets that you do have a long-term plan to bring things under control. That, from the policymaker perspective, is essentially the purpose they serve. It's a kind of marketing. Now, it doesn't, I think, serve the kind of purpose that we as classical liberals might want those fiscal rules to serve, which is to limit the growth of the state over the long term. If you wanted a fiscal rule that did that, I think you would want to simplify quite significantly and possibly just do something very simple like a spending cap, that spending could only grow in line with, well, you could even say the public sector has to grow smaller than the private sector over a certain period of time. You could tie it to increases in population, adjusted for age or something as well. But all of these complicated rules, they're there to be gamed, and you can't get that angry with this government for gaming them when all of the other governments have as well. I mean, I'd sort of defer to Andrew on this point about the asset purchase facility. Obviously, there's a lack of symmetry here because the Treasury has benefited from the Bank of England's income from the asset purchase facility going to the Treasury for many years. So perhaps now to exclude it does seem a little bit rich, but it also seems to me not necessarily the kind of thing that you should be focusing on when you're talking about fiscal rules.
Well, a couple of things. So clearly, it's a having your cake and eating it kind of thing as well, right? Where you decide that in the good times, so we're going to take the benefits, and in the bad times, what relevance does that have? Right. So that I think is clearly the case. On the other hand, I think it's I don't approve of fiscal rules in general. I did a study on these things back in 2009 in the run-up to the... although Osborne didn't take this particular aspect of things, my view at the time was that when you looked at various international and historical cases and you studied them in depth, fiscal rules were much less effective than a just do it. If you want to cut the deficit, just cut the deficit. That's the thing to do. Don't put out some things saying I'm promising to cut the deficit.
You actually have to do it.
That's just doing it. I think people have started to refer this as the try theory of politics. That the key thing is to try. It's not to say this or that or set up something that makes me do it. You've actually got to go and do it. Even though amongst the daft idea of having fiscal rules, the fiscal rules that we have are particularly daft ones. This business of saying, well, debt has to be contracting out in the whatever it is, third, fifth, whichever year you want to set of the period.
It's always 5 years in the future.
That's right. So then I can make it go high in the short term, provided it's dropping. So I can keep changing in my policy so that I'm always making it go up, provided it goes down. That is a terrible fiscal rule. So the government tweaking, nonsensically tweaking a nonsensical fiscal rule that you shouldn't have anyway, isn't something which I find to be an issue of deep concern. I think there are much bigger questions. The fiscal situation is very perilous, but it doesn't make that very perilous situation any worse to do this kind of thing.
All right, a good note to end on, I think. Andrew, Matthew, thank you very much. Thank you to all of those of you watching or listening at home. If you enjoyed what you heard here, please subscribe on YouTube or on your podcast provider of choice. Lots more about these issues and many others at iea.org.uk. And please sign up for our weekly newsletter at insider.iea.org.uk. You can also receive invitations to our events, our blog posts, and this podcast on Substack. Until next time, thanks very much.